And now on to our next session. We're pleased to present a pair of special reports. The first speaker is Daniel Aronson, founder of Valitus. Daniel works with global leaders to help them develop strategies for driving innovation and value through sustainability and responsibility practices. Daniel will share his insights with us about monetizing the business value of operating with purpose. Daniel Aronson.
Thank you. Now, as you've been seeing, there'll be questions, and I want to give you a little bit of fair warning. Feel free to think of the hard questions about value, the really difficult ones. If you can come up with an impossible one, so much better. Because, frankly, this topic, monetizing the value of operating with purpose, this topic stops us from making some of the progress that we need to make. And the more challenging questions we can get out, and the more we can answer them, the better. All right, deal? All right. Monetizing the value of operating with purpose. We're going to talk about that in a few different ways, but there are some key components. The most important thing isn't the monetizing per se, and isn't the purpose per se. The most important thing is this is how we do more in the world. How do we express our purpose? How do businesses express our purpose? How do we create what we want in the world? Monetizing isn't the majority of that. The majority of that is having the purpose and expressing the purpose. But it matters. It matters to our ability to make it happen. That's what we're going to talk about. Let me tell you a story. A $50 billion company, a client of mine, 2 years ago they decided they were going to have good, ambitious sustainability targets. They created them, they got executive approval for them, they put them out into the organization, and nothing. There wasn't the buy-in. There wasn't the funding. There wasn't the action. And why not? Well, there were a few reasons. One of them was that the business people outside of the executive suite didn't buy it. And that's because they had jobs to do. They said, this is great, we like this idea, we want to be able to tell our kids that we're doing this, but we also have to hit our financial targets. And the other reason is that they couldn't get the full funding, even from the people who just approved the targets. I see nodding. This is not a good sign. However, if you end up nodding to the next part of the story, it'll be a better sign. Because about 2 weeks ago, they tried again. They got executive approval for really ambitious sustainability targets. For example, they're one of the first half dozen companies in the world to announce something that's a really ambitious sustainability target. They also got tremendous support from inside the organization. And they asked for much more funding than most people in this field ever ask for. And they got it. Now, there are a couple of differences. One is that the person in charge of this effort did a better job of reaching out and building bridges and bringing people in. And that's very important. The other is they were able to quantify over the course of about 8 months that we worked with them. They were able to quantify that they would get twice as much money back as they spent. That made it a little easier to get the money. Not everything that the company does, or that any company does, has a really high ROI. And in this field, we often get the presumption that what we're talking about is an expense, not an investment, and that it's not going to pay off. And so we get the red light, or at the very least, we get the yellow light. But if we change that, if we can show the true value of what we're doing, of operating with purpose and of living values, if we can show the value of values, then we can get the green light a lot more often. What do we mean by purpose? Well, the short version is, it's thinking beyond the transaction alone and thinking beyond today, right? And you have to look outward and think beyond this transaction that you and I are having, beyond this thing today. What matters? What matters to us? And then it's not enough to look outward. You also have to build that in to how you do the business. Now, there are a lot more pieces to purpose, and you can see different levels of engagement with purpose. I'm going to show you something today that's a little bit of a teaser because the tool itself is just an alpha. But last week, Sustainable Brands, where I'm a board member, unveiled a new framework for business transformation. They call it the roadmap. And one entire section of that is figuring out where you are in terms of purpose, in terms of embedding purpose into the business and into the operations. And I was part of the content council that helped with the content, although by the time I joined it, most of the content was done. But then I built the tool for it. And what you're going to see here is a little tiny snippet of an alpha version tool. So it's not perfect. But it gives you a sense for the kinds of questions and the kinds of things that help to know where are we in our evolution toward really building in purpose. You can see on top, the very first question is, we have a purpose. And also, if you ask two people, you'd get something similar for answers. And it's not just a purpose beyond the transaction, but it's environmental or social in some way. And then you can see some of these other specific manifestations of purpose. It drives our strategy and marketing and so forth. There's a lot more to this assessment and a lot more to this tool than you're seeing here. But just to give you a sense for what it means concretely, these are just a few of the things that it means concretely. To start by saying we have a purpose, and then to evolve beyond having it to living it, to operating with purpose. In order to take that operating with purpose and turn it into monetization, you need to be able to do two things. The first is you need to be able to measure it. And the second thing is you need to be able to value it. Now, measuring and valuing are both difficult. That's okay. It'd be nice if this were easier. But because they're difficult, when we do them well, when we measure the things that people elsewhere in the organization think we can't measure, and when we put a dollar value on the things that people think we can't do that for, well, as one of my clients who was the CFO of the largest division of J&J said, it changes the conversation. Now, it's good to be able to measure it. And it's good to be able to put a value on it. And those are in large part both technical and vision-related challenges. But that's not all it takes. People say numbers speak for themselves. I've got news for you. They don't. I wish they did. It would be easier if you could say, look, there it is. See the answer? But think about your own experiences trying to get something different done, trying to get a real change. You say, look, 32. Okay. The reason is that human beings are not primarily numbers driven. What are we driven by? Well, I'll give you an example. You may have heard that there's been some incredible advances in supercomputing technology. I'm going to tell you an apocryphal story about that. Imagine that last week they had finally figured out how to make atom-level supercomputing at the scale of cities. Okay? The most powerful supercomputer ever. Well, according to the story, they said to this computer, they said, do you compute that you will ever think like a person? And oddly enough, even for a computer this powerful, there was a pause. And you could actually see the lights dim as it pulled enormous amounts of power to run this computer. And finally, the answer came back, that reminds me of a story. That's because, as it is said, the shortest distance between truth and a human being is a story. You might wonder, what does this have to do with monetizing? This is not about the numbers. That's not exactly true. The thing is, the content of the stories matters. The stories that we want to tell are sometimes about emotions, sometimes about this feels good. We're expressing ourselves, we're giving people livelihoods. And sometimes they're about something else. Sometimes they're about how are we making things better? How are we improving our environmental or social impact? How are we showing that there's a business value to doing that? We have to take those stories and we have to imbue them with the intelligence of the numbers. Measurement and valuation are good for two things: prove and improve. First, we have to prove that what we're doing is important, useful, valuable. And then, once we're doing that, then we engage the capacity that humans have to take something and improve it, which is how we get this incredible Moore's Law and all these other advances. In order for us to scale doing the right thing, operating with purpose, we need to do both the proving and the improving. And we need to tell effective stories about doing that. There are, broadly speaking, 4 types of motivation, I think. We're going to talk about the money type, but it's useful to look at all the kinds. The first one is emotions. This feels good. This feels right. It really energizes our employees. That matters. One of the tools that my company created years ago was something that puts a value on the employee engagement that comes from sustainability. Well, why does that happen? Right? Even if you haven't put a value on it, everybody knows that employees are more engaged when they're doing something that matters because of the emotion, because of that connection between their values and yours. The second one is completion. Think about people you know. Think about if you know someone like this. And this will explain everything that I mean about completion. They do something that they need to get done, an errand or a task, and then they think, I didn't have that on my to-do list. And they write it down and check it off. That satisfaction is the motivation of completion. The third one is numbers. And this is distinct from money because numbers can drive us. They can say, I want this product to last 32% longer. And if you get engineers or people driven by numbers, you can see the desire, the passion with saying to themselves, we've got it to 28%. How can we get that last 4 or 5% to meet the goal? And then there's money. And there's nothing wrong with the motivation of money. The way that I believe is that all of us, everyone, has these 4 motivators in some variation of intensity. They have different first and second priorities, but we have them all. And what that means is that for a lot of us, we might be willing to do something that we can't show the dollar value of. But some of us really want to do something sustainable, but it has to also make money. And some of us want to make money first and foremost, and they're willing to do something sustainable. There's nothing wrong with it, but it's not the primary motivation. And the thing is, we need all those kinds of people. We are behind schedule. We need to tap all those kinds of motivations. And the issue is that we're pretty good at talking about the emotional impact. There are lots of fantastic communicators in sustainability, some of them in this room, about emotions, values, and so on. Think about how many great communicators you know about the business value of sustainability. That's a problem. In fact, when I started doing this work over a decade and a half ago, shortly after, I conducted a survey of leaders in social responsibility and sustainability space. These were companies that had $50 million and up in annual commitments, so these were real leaders. And I asked them, what fraction of the value that you create for the business do you think is actually captured by your measurements? The average was low. 2/3 of the respondents, remember these are the leaders, 2/3 of the respondents said that under a quarter of the value they produced was captured. Well, a baker's dozen years later, I repeated that with a different set of leaders who were talking about ROI. We went from 66%, 13 years prior, all the way to 60%, saying under 25% was captured. That's hardly progress, and it's definitely not enough. And that's why monetizing the value matters, because we're terrible at it. And it's essential to getting more buy-in and more done. A few principles. The first is that the biggest change in seeing the true value of operating with purpose, of living our values, isn't actually a calculation change. There is that, it comes later. The biggest change is seeing that the value that is easily visible is a tiny fraction of the true value. Most of the value is what I call submerged. Once you recognize that it's there, you see it. But mostly it's missed the first time. Here's an example for waste. Think for a second about the value of reducing waste. How much is it worth to the business to waste less? In dollars. Don't think about reputation, employee engagement, concrete hard dollars. Think about the categories in which you would put these benefits. The most likely category that you're thinking of is, I don't have to pay someone to truck it away. That's almost universally true. It's about $200 a ton for most kinds of waste. Great. You're saving $200 a ton, 2,000 pounds in a ton, 10 cents a pound. It's not nothing. The second most common, and when we did this, there was a session I was at NYU about the business value of sustainability earlier this year, and we did this in the room, and the facilitator asked, what else? And about a quarter of the people said, also, if we didn't waste it, we wouldn't have to buy it to begin with. That's actually a much bigger value. And then the facilitator said, anything else? Silence. But here's the problem. That misses all the submerged value. To give you a quick example, if you don't waste it, you not only don't have to buy it, you don't have to pay someone to write the PO for it. You don't have to get it unloaded off the ship at the dock. It doesn't have to go on the truck. It doesn't have to get unloaded from the truck. It doesn't have to go in the forklift. You don't have to put it somewhere in your warehouse. You don't have to move it around in the warehouse. You don't have to track it if it has an expiration date. You don't have to rent the warehouse space. If there's anything hazardous in it at all, you don't have to certify that you're handling it correctly. Once you're done with it, you don't have to move it again to the loading dock to get it removed. You don't have to certify that you disposed of it properly, and then you don't have to pay to have someone take it away. That doesn't even count if you're using lean or theory of constraints, the value of lowering the total inventory level in the system. None of these are the least bit intangible. The payment for the forklift, the rental for the warehouse space, the administration, none of these are fluffy. None of these are intangible. And yet, we miss them. Why? Because they're submerged. And because it takes a different perspective to surface them. It turns out, in my counting over the last 15 plus years, there are about 36 different categories of business benefit in 4 different areas: the customer behavior, the employee behavior, the value network behavior, and the risk. Which means there's a lot of value out there. And we need to surface it, quantify it, monetize it, and capture it. We could talk about all of these, but just very briefly. Customers, they care about sustainability, about values, after everything else is taken care of. But they still care. And it makes them more loyal. Right? They may not choose to buy the product, but Method, the cleaning company, found that although sustainability wasn't a reason that people bought the product, it was the #1 driver of retention. It enables people to bring their full abilities to work. They're more engaged, they get more done, they provide more value. It generates innovation. When I was at a previous job, we conducted what may have been the first study quantifying the value of sustainability leadership for innovation leadership. And it turns out there's a very strong connection, much, much stronger than people thought there would be. Now, there are challenges. We'll talk about a few of those challenges. The first one is even visible value is underestimated. If we don't add it up, we often don't see how much it is. For example, for one client, we looked at just the cost of the waste, just the cost of electricity, energy, space, and so on. And when we finished adding it up, it was several times more than they thought, just because they'd never put it all in one place and added it up before. Another thing is it has to be presented differently. Because people are not used to monetizing this, you can't just say, here's the number. Because then it's an argument. No, it's not 11.4% improvement, it's at most 10.5. The way I handle this is to build a model and a tool where we sit on the same side of the table and change the assumptions together and see what happens. It turns out if it goes from 300% ROI to 150% ROI, that sounds like a lot. But you're still going to do something with 150% ROI, right? It doesn't change the decision. And finally, people say there's no precision. Yeah, that's true. I don't know how much it'll cost me if I get in an accident. But I still avoid it because it doesn't matter that I can't predict it with precision. I know it's a bad idea. That comes to this one fact, which is that we know the value isn't something. If we know there's value to sustainability in some way, then when we don't count it, as John Sturman at MIT says, we give it the only value it can't possibly have, which is 0. How do we handle some of these things? Well, I'll just give you one quick example. People say purpose, responsibility, sustainability, they're nice, but they're just the icing on the cake. And what I tell them is, that's true. It's not the number one thing. If the car doesn't drive, it doesn't matter if it's sustainably produced. But you've been to any bakeries recently? Cakes are all iced. All right, let's talk about your questions about making change and about valuation.
Okay, any questions from the audience? No? I see one coming forward. I'll ask one. We have just a minute or two, Daniel. But how would someone go about beginning the process of finding the submerged value and monetizing that, and then developing a story around it?
How do you find submerged value, surface it, monetize it? Well, the short answer is that you have to look for the domino effect. That's why the last slide there had the dominoes on it, because you have to look for the domino effects upstream and downstream of your changes. It turns out that it takes a little while to become good at this. I'm not sure I'm done learning. I certainly hope not, and I've been doing it a decade and a half. But once you've found these, finding out how to quantify and monetize is a matter of looking for interesting techniques, of finding the data that exists, the digital footprints, for example, that already exist, and using things like triangulation to get a signal out of a noisy world. These are technical issues, though. The biggest thing is the vision. The biggest thing is the vision to see submerged value. After that, you don't have to be perfect at measuring it, because right now, it's being missed entirely.
Okay, we have a lot of questions, and unfortunately, we're pretty much at our time. But for those who asked about Daniel's tool, his business is Valuedus. Is it valuedus.com, Daniel?
Yes,
You
indeed.
can find more information about his tool there. And then the questions that came forward just now have to do with whether this is a process that's really only available to the fortunate with resources, and whether it's a problem to deal with bias in quantifying value. Can you speak very quickly?
Very briefly. Let me just say that I'm not leaving right away. If there are people who want to talk more, happy to talk a little bit or to arrange time to talk later, because it doesn't shock me there might be a few questions about this. I'm actually kind of heartened by that because we need to get better at this as a field. In terms of, is it available only to the fortunate with resources? No. The biggest resource that you need to get this done is the vision to see the submerged value. After that, some of the tools and things are commercial. Some of the things that you can do can be done on the back of a napkin. But the biggest thing is seeing what's there. As far as bias goes in quantification, yeah, it exists. Personally, what I do is bias my estimates in a conservative direction. Why? Because The audience will give you more credibility if you're not stretching or if you're not perceived as stretching. And also because sustainability is so valuable, operating with purpose is so valuable that you can make the case with conservative numbers. And after that, everything else is gravy.
Okay, I want to thank Daniel Aronson.
Thank you, Daniel Aronson. That was good. And again, I'm sorry if we ran out of time for some of the questions. Daniel, I know you'll be around for a little bit. So if there are any questions specifically that didn't get answered, see Daniel right after this session. So thank you.